When I think back to those years in the old neighborhood, it's almost like remembering an entirely different chapter of my life, one where the air felt heavier, the nights seemed darker, and the smallest things could linger in your head for days. It was more than a decade ago, but I can still picture the cracked sidewalks, the pale yellow street lamps that barely lit the road, and the faint hum of crickets in the summertime when the windows were open. It was the kind of neighborhood where you knew most of the people by name, or at least by the make of their car and the number of kids they had. We weren't rich, but we weren't scraping by either. It was a working-class pocket on the edge of the city, close enough to the bus lines and the grocery store, but far enough out that you could still find raccoons digging through your trash at night. I'd been living there with my wife Karen and our 2 kids, Emma and Tyler. Emma was 8 at the time, old enough to be curious about the world but still young enough to run to us when she had a bad dream. Tyler was 5 and obsessed with anything that had wheels, from toy cars to the garbage truck that came rumbling by every Tuesday morning. The house itself was small but solid, built in the late 70s, with a sloped roof that made a constant ticking sound whenever it rained. I used to love that sound. It was like the house was talking to me in a language I didn't need to translate. The living room had this big bay window that looked out onto the street, and I could sit there for hours just watching the rhythm of the neighborhood. That's where I first noticed him, Greg. At least I learned his name was Greg later. At the time he was just the guy with the Harley to me. His house was maybe 6 doors up from ours, on the same side of the street, and he stood out not because he was friendly or neighborly, but because he radiated this constant air of don't bother me. The lawn was patchy, the blinds always drawn, and the driveway was where that massive black Harley Davidson sat like it owned the block. Now don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with motorcycles. I've even admired them from a distance. There's something undeniably cool about a machine built for speed and freedom. But Greg's Harley wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a weapon. Straight pipes, no muffler. When that engine roared to life, it didn't just announce itself, it invaded your home, climbed into your bed, and shook you awake whether you wanted it to or not. At first it was just an occasional thing. I'd hear it in the daytime when I was working in the garage or mowing the lawn. It was loud, sure, but I figured, it's his bike, his property. Let him enjoy it. I tried to ignore the way the sound lingered long after he'd turned the corner, rattling in my chest like an aftershock. But then came the night rides. The first time it was around 2:30 in the morning. I was dead asleep when this bone-rattling roar erupted from up the street. My eyes flew open, my heart pounding. For a split second I thought maybe there'd been an explosion. But no, it was Greg, firing up that Harley in the dead of night and tearing down the road like he was in a race only he knew about. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening as the sound faded into the distance, replaced by the silence of a neighborhood that had just been rudely yanked out of its dreams. I remember thinking, well, maybe it's just a one-time thing. It wasn't. Over the weeks it became a pattern, sometimes 1 a.m., sometimes 3 a.m., but always the same ritual. Engine on, full throttle down the block, no hesitation. And every time I'd find myself lying awake long after the noise was gone, my mind buzzing with irritation. I wasn't the only one either. I could see it in the faces of the neighbors when I'd pass them on the sidewalk. Red eyes, sluggish steps, the unspoken agreement that yeah, we'd all been woken up again. I started wondering what the hell he was doing at those hours. Was it work? Some shady deal? I pictured him meeting up with biker buddies for late-night poker games, or maybe slipping into the shadows for something less legal. My mind would run wild with theories in those sleepless hours, because what kind of person chooses to disrupt an entire block just for the hell of it? You'd think someone would say something, right? Well, here's the thing. There was a cop living right across from Greg. You'd assume that would keep things in check, but nope. This officer, don't get me wrong, he seemed like a decent guy when I'd wave at him. Never once, as far as I could tell, stepped in. No knock on the door. No conversation about noise ordinances. Nothing. It was baffling. And here's where I started to notice something about myself. I've never been a confrontational person. I'm the type who will mutter under my breath in the car instead of honking. I'll stew about something for days but avoid direct conflict if I can help it. But there's a limit to how many times you can be shaken awake in the middle of the night before that quiet, non-confrontational side starts to erode. At first I tried to reason with myself. He probably doesn't realize how loud it is, I thought. Maybe it's just a phase. But phases are supposed to end, and this one didn't. Instead, it started to shape my nights. I'd go to bed dreading the possibility of that roar, lying there listening for the faintest sign that Greg was about to fire it up. And on the nights when it didn't happen, I still wouldn't sleep well, because I'd been on edge for hours. It's amazing how one person's thoughtlessness can creep into your life like that, changing your habits, your mood, even your health. Karen noticed it too. She never said much. She's always been better at letting things roll off her back, but I could see the way she'd sigh when it happened, the way she'd roll over and pull the blanket tighter. It might sound small to someone who's never lived through it, but those nights, they added up. They made our home feel less like a place of rest and more like a place where you were just waiting to be interrupted. And I didn't know it then, but that simmering frustration was slowly turning into something else, something sharper, something that eventually, I wasn't going to be able to ignore. I can't tell you the exact night when my patience finally started to give way, but I can tell you it was in late September. The air had that crispness that makes you think about pulling out sweaters and hot coffee. Emma had just started 3rd grade, and Tyler was in kindergarten. The days were shorter, and by the time I got home from work, the sun was already bleeding into the horizon. I remember because that night had been one of those rare evenings where everything went smoothly. The kids did their homework without complaint. Karen made a pot of chili that filled the house with warmth, and we all watched an old Pixar movie together. It was one of those small, quiet family nights you tuck away in your mind as a reminder of what you're working so hard for. By 10:30, we were all in bed. I remember thinking as I drifted towards sleep that it had been a good day, an uncomplicated day, the kind you wish you could bottle and open on the rough ones. And then, at 3:07 a.m., the world split open. That Harley roared to life like a bomb had gone off. Not a hesitant, groggy start, but an immediate aggressive blast, full throttle from the second the key turned. My whole body jolted upright before my brain even caught up. I glanced over and saw Karen groan and pull the pillow over her head. Down the hall, I could hear Emma's little voice, groggy and scared, calling for me. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and went to her room. She was sitting up, clutching her blanket, eyes wide. She asked me if something bad had happened outside. I told her it was just the neighbor's motorcycle and that everything was fine. But the truth was, I didn't believe my own words. Everything wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for months. I stood by her window, listening as Greg tore down the block, shifting gears like he was on a racetrack, the sound slicing through the still night air until it faded into the distance. And there I was, holding my daughter's hand, thinking about how insane it was that one man's late-night joyride could shake a whole house awake like that. I didn't go back to sleep after that. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring at the clock. 4 a.m. 5. I could feel the day's weight pressing in before it even began. And when I got to work later that morning, I felt it in my bones, heavy, distracted, irritated. I snapped at a coworker over something minor. I forgot to reply to an important email. My boss noticed, asked if I was all right. I lied and said I was just under the weather. The truth was uglier. I was becoming consumed. After that night, it felt like the rides became more frequent. Not every night, but enough that my body seemed permanently on alert for them. I'd wake up at 1:15 a.m. for no reason, convinced I'd heard the engine, only to lie there with my heart racing. One Saturday, I was out front mowing the lawn when Greg rolled up on the Harley in broad daylight. No helmet, sunglasses on, that smug expression like he was starring in his own action movie. He didn't look my way, he never did, but the sound still punched through me like a blast wave. The smell of exhaust hung in the air long after he'd killed the engine. And here's the thing, part of me wanted to just march up to him right then and there. I could picture it in my head, me standing in his driveway, laying it all out, telling him he was waking up my kids, the whole neighborhood. But in my mind, I also pictured the smirk he'd give me, maybe even a "what are you gonna do about it?" And I knew that if he reacted that way, my anger might tip into something I couldn't take back. So I didn't say anything. I swallowed it, like I'd been doing for months. But swallowing anger doesn't make it disappear. It just lets it fester. That winter, the rides got rarer, probably because the roads were slick and freezing. But every once in a while there it was again. That roar in the middle of the night, cutting through the sound of the wind against the siding. And every time I'd find myself lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, imagining ways to make it stop. I'm not proud of it, but my mind went places it had never gone before. I thought about noise complaints, though clearly the cop neighbor wasn't going to do anything. I thought about filing something with the city, but the process was slow, and who knew if it would even work. Then my thoughts got darker. Things like a mysterious sugar dump into the gas tank, or something sharp in the road. Nothing that would kill him, just something that would make him think twice. It was a few months later, in early spring, when the moment finally came. He'd been quiet for a while, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, and I'd almost started to think he'd either moved or sold the bike. But then, at 3:15 a.m., there it was again. The roar, the full throttle, the street vibrating under the sound. I didn't even feel startled this time. I felt cold, detached, like the decision had already been made. I lay there in bed, listening as he disappeared into the night, and I thought, that's the last time. By the time morning rolled around, the plan was in place. Simple, effective, not something that would get me caught, and it started with a little box of roofing nails. The morning after the last ride, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and determination swirling inside me as I grabbed the little box of roofing nails from the garage. The sun was just beginning to stretch its fingers across the sky, painting everything a soft pink and gold. The neighborhood was still mostly quiet, except for the birds waking up and the occasional distant car hum. For the first time in months, I felt like I was going to do something, not just lie awake and stew, but actually take back a bit of control. I remember pulling into the driveway a little earlier than usual that day, trying to keep my movements casual, so no one would suspect a thing. Greg's bike sat there, gleaming black in the morning light, parked right at the edge of the driveway, where it was impossible to miss. The previous night's sound was still fresh in my ears, that roar like a punch in the gut. I got out and quietly opened the box of nails. The nails were rusty but sharp, long, thin enough to puncture tires if they found their mark. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. Was I crossing a line? Was this the right move? My mind raced through the consequences. Could I get caught? Would the police find out? Could I be labeled a vigilante? But none of that mattered as much as the memories of those long nights, the disturbed sleep, the tired eyes of my kids and neighbors. I dropped a handful of nails across his driveway, spreading them out like a loose warning. I wanted to send a message, not cause harm, although I wasn't sure anymore where that line was. I felt my heartbeat in my throat as I slid back into my car and drove off, heart pounding with a mix of fear and something like satisfaction. That day at work, I couldn't focus. I kept picturing Greg stepping out in the morning, seeing the nails, and finally realizing that someone was fed up. I imagined the sound of him screaming curses, or better yet, hearing that roar stop for good. For once, I felt like I had taken the reins. But as days passed, the roaring didn't stop. I waited for the quiet, for that sense of peace that had been missing for so long. But no, not even a week later, I was jolted awake once again by the all-too-familiar rumble. Greg was back on the bike, full throttle, tearing through the streets like nothing had changed. I felt my chest tighten. I'd thought the nails would be enough, maybe scare him off for a while. Instead, he came back like a challenge, daring me to do more. So I did. The next morning, I returned to the driveway and emptied the rest of the box. Nails everywhere, lined up like little landmines waiting for wheels to roll over them. I told myself it was the last step, that this would finally get the message through. This time, there was no hesitation, no lingering doubts, just action. Days went by, and slowly, the nights grew quiet. No more roar, no more full throttle escape routes, no more ripping through our neighborhood like he owned the place. I didn't know if Greg had gotten a flat tire, or if the nails had finally worked, but I didn't care. For the first time in a long time, the night felt still again. Yet, even in that silence, I realized something. There was a cost. I could feel it in the way my shoulders relaxed just slightly, but my mind stayed restless. I'd crossed a line I never thought I would. The anger that fueled me had shifted into a strange mix of guilt and relief. Karen noticed it right away. She said nothing, but I could tell by the way she watched me that she sensed the storm inside. She asked once if I was okay, if work was stressful, or if I was getting enough sleep. I wanted to tell her everything, but the words caught in my throat. Our kids though, they were better off. Emma stopped waking up in the middle of the night. Tyler started sleeping through the noise that once rattled his small room. The neighborhood seemed to breathe again. But for me, The scars lingered in ways I couldn't explain. In the weeks that followed, I found myself replaying the whole thing over and over in my head. Was I justified? Was this the kind of neighbor I wanted to be? Did I risk turning into the very person I resented? I couldn't shake the thought that maybe there was a better way, some peaceful solution I missed. But I also knew that if I had waited any longer, I might have snapped in a far worse way. The quiet wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a reminder of what I'd done to make it happen. And the neighborhood, well, the other neighbors kept their distance from Greg after that. A few of them told me later they'd noticed the nails but didn't know who had put them there. They were just relieved the Harley stopped disturbing their sleep. One evening, as I stood on my porch, sipping cold beer, I looked up the street at Greg's house. The blinds were still closed tight, the driveway empty. I wondered if he was home, or if he'd given up the bike altogether. I thought about the cop across the street, who never acted, the silence that had stretched for so long, and I realized something. Sometimes people don't change because they want to, or because someone asks nicely. Sometimes it takes a little push. After the last ride and the nails in the driveway, something shifted inside me that I hadn't expected. It wasn't just that the noise stopped. It was that the whole experience cracked open a part of myself I hadn't really looked at before. For years I had buried my frustration, thinking that anger was something to avoid, that patience was a virtue. But standing there, watching the quiet settle over the neighborhood like a fragile glass, I realized patience only gets you so far. Sometimes you have to act, even if it means breaking your own rules. At first, I felt triumphant. The silence was proof that I'd won, that I'd restored some peace to my family and my home. But that feeling was fleeting, replaced quickly by a heavier weight. It wasn't guilt exactly, but a complicated mix of relief, uncertainty, and a nagging sense of moral ambiguity. I kept wondering, did I become what I hated in Greg? Was I justified in taking justice into my own hands? Or had I crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? The questions haunted me, sometimes when I least expected it. Driving home from work, I'd catch myself thinking about how fragile the peace really was, and how easily it could shatter again. I found my mind drifting to other parts of my life, wondering what else I'd been tolerating or ignoring, hoping someone else would fix it for me. This whole experience was like a mirror, reflecting the parts of me I didn't want to see. Karen noticed the change before I did. She could tell that I was more tense some days, quieter on others. One night, she asked if I was all right, and I tried to brush it off, but she pressed gently, and for the first time in a long time, I opened up a little, not about the nails or Greg, but about how the nights had been, how the noise had worn me down piece by piece. She listened without judgment, just holding my hand, and that simple act made me realize how important it was to share the burden rather than carry it alone. At work, I started paying attention to how stress was creeping into other corners of my life. The irritability, the distracted moments, the creeping exhaustion. I could see the ripple effects extending far beyond just the loud bike. I began carving out time for myself, going for runs early in the morning before the city woke up, listening to podcasts that talked about mindfulness and resilience. It felt like a slow reclamation of myself, a way to patch up the cracks that had formed under the weight of months of sleepless nights and simmering anger. But there was also a new confidence growing. I realized I had the power to set boundaries, to protect what mattered most without waiting for others to step in. The nails in the driveway were a small rebellion, yes, but they marked a turning point, a refusal to be silenced or pushed aside. I also started connecting with neighbors in a way I hadn't before. At the local corner store, conversations about the bike began surfacing more openly. People shared their own frustrations, their sleepless nights, the way their children had been startled awake. It felt good to know I wasn't alone, that we shared this invisible thread of unrest. We even talked about forming a neighborhood watch or petitioning the city to enforce noise laws more strictly. It was the beginning of community, and I felt a flicker of hope. And then there was Greg. I never confronted him directly, never left a note or tried to explain. I'm not sure if he ever realized what had happened, or if the nails even stopped him. The house remained quiet, the blinds stayed shut, and eventually the bike disappeared. Whether he sold it or just parked it indefinitely, I'll never know. But in a way, that mystery was part of the story. Some battles are won quietly, without a single word exchanged. Looking back, I understand now that the experience was about more than a noisy motorcycle. It was about reclaiming control over my life, setting limits on what I would accept, and realizing that sometimes the peace we crave requires standing up for ourselves, even when it's hard or uncomfortable. I learned that patience isn't just about waiting, it's about knowing when to act. Most importantly, I learned that peace isn't just the absence of noise, but the presence of boundaries, respect and connection. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally moving toward that kind of peace, one that isn't fragile or easily broken, but built from the inside out. It's funny how life has a way of moving on, even when you think you're stuck in one moment forever. After the nails, after the silence, the neighborhood slowly settled back into its rhythm. The quiet streets, the soft hum of distant traffic, the kids playing outside again, without that sudden roar ripping through their afternoons. It all felt like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding for years. Sometimes I'd walk past Greg's old house, the one with the empty driveway and drawn blinds, and wonder about him. Who was he beneath that tough exterior? Was the bike the only thing keeping him tethered to some idea of freedom, or was it just noise to drown out his own silence? I never got answers, and maybe that's the point. Some stories end not with closure, but with questions. What I do know is how it changed me. The frustration, the restless nights, the anger, they all left marks, but also lessons. I became more aware of how much our environment shapes us, how the smallest disruptions can ripple out in ways we don't expect. More than that, I learned the importance of standing up for yourself, not with fists or fury, but with resolve and a clear sense of what you deserve. Karen and I grew stronger too. Sharing those hard moments without blame, just honest conversation, pulled us closer. We started carving out little sanctuaries in our home, quiet corners for reading, weekend mornings without screens or noise, dinners where the only sound was laughter. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The kids, they grew up surrounded by the echoes of that time. Emma talks now about how she used to wake up scared, and how it felt when the street finally quieted. Tyler still loves wheels, cars, bikes, anything that moves, but I see him also learning about respect and boundaries in his own way. I hope that story, our story, teaches them that peace isn't just given. Sometimes you have to fight for it. And me, I'm still a work in progress. I carry the memory of those nights and the choices I made, but I don't let them weigh me down. Instead, they remind me that even when life gets loud and chaotic, you can find your own silence, and in that silence, rebuild. Looking back over those years, I don't regret what I did. Sometimes, small acts ripple into big changes. Sometimes justice isn't neat or clean, but messy and real. And sometimes the quiet that follows is the sweetest sound of all.